Give me just 1 second. I'll be right.
Sure thing.
Mia, should I say Sucharov or Sucharov?
Sucharov.
Sucharov.
Give it another minute or two. People still are filtering in, it looks like. Figure out where that's coming from and mute that. Thanks. All right, I think we can get started. So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Israeli-Palestine, What's Happening, What's Next, and How Do We Talk About It webinar. My name is Adam Leibovich, and I'm the Dean of the University of Pittsburgh's Dietrich School of Arts and Sciences and the College of General Studies. I'd like to thank Professor Rachel Cranston, Director of our Jewish Studies program, for coordinating this event. I'm also grateful to our co-sponsors, the School of Law Center for Civil Rights and Racial Justice, the University's Center for International Studies, Pitt Global, and the Chancellor's Office. The events of the past several days have been heartbreaking and horrifying. And at times like this, when the world feels impossibly divided and irreparably damaged, it can be hard to imagine a path forward. But it's for exactly this reason that it's so important for us to come together in our grief and anger and despair to remind ourselves that we're not alone and to listen to each other. We are fortunate today to have with us renowned experts on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Political science professor Mira Sucharov from Carleton University and law professor Omar Dajani from the University of the Pacific. Mira and Omar are academics who use the tools of humanism to work together across differences in background and perspective, not only civilly, but productively and with genuine friendship. They are frequent collaborators and are currently writing a dual travel memoir on space, place, and emotion in Israel and Palestine, as well as developing a podcast on the past and future of Jaffa called The Vacant Lot. People may wonder what stake colleges and universities have in this issue. We don't make laws, we don't negotiate treaties. What can we possibly contribute to this incredibly complicated, devastating situation? But events like this one wonderfully illustrate exactly what the Academy offers: an opportunity to use our humanism to build productive conversation at times when this feels hardest to do. As Mira recently wrote, quote, "Ultimately, Omar and I agree that to be human is to care deeply about both one's own and about one another, whoever they are. I suppose that's the start." Now I'd like to turn the program over to Professor Rachel Cranston and Professor Sheila Velez Martinez, the Jack and Lovell Olander Professor of Asylum, Refugee, and Immigration Law and Director of Clinical Programs at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law.
Thank you, Dean Lebovich. As Dean Lebovich said, I'm Sheila Velez Martinez. I'm also the director of the Center for Civil Rights and Racial Justice at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. We're here today because we are alarmed, saddened, and trying to process the dramatic escalation of violence in Palestine and Israel. Such a toll on human life is case for fear and for mourning. As academics, we want to validate the feelings of our community while at the same time offer that these experiences of vulnerability and loss do not have to lead straight away to violence, retribution, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. We ask you to engage with us today from that perspective. Thus, we will monitor the Q&A with firm hand to prevent any hate speech. As Judith Butler teaches us, it is not moral relativism to abhor the attacks on ethical grounds, feel a full measure of grief for those who have lost their loved ones and homes, while at the same time endeavor to produce another public culture and other public discourse from hate. Today, we aspire to create a space that allows us to converse, process, and give context together as an academic community committed to a just and lasting peace in the region. Rachel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Cranston. I'm the Director of Jewish Studies here at the University of Pittsburgh. Thank you to everyone who is here this evening. Thank you to everybody who has made this really crucial conversation happen. And thank you so much to our panelists for being here and for agreeing to do this on such short notice. Before we get started, I just want to add one thing. First of all, I just want to acknowledge that the situation in Israel and Gaza has been terrifying and excruciatingly painful for many of us, especially those of us, and I myself am in this category, who have family and loved ones who live in the region. I'm aware that some of you may be in too much acute pain to join a conversation like this, which may stretch and challenge your thoughts and preconceived notions about Israel and Palestine. If this is where you are, then by all means, this might not be the time to attend this program. This might be the time to focus on your healing. Your well-being matters, and it comes first. So please, please be aware of where you are and be aware of what you are able to cope with right now. But for those of you who are ready, you are warmly invited to a conversation that will highlight shared humanism during this moment of excruciating pain and humanitarian crisis. Okay, so with that, I am going to introduce our first panelist. Omar Dajani is professor of law at the McGeorge School of Law at the University of Pacific in Sacramento, California, where he teaches public international law and U.S. constitutional law, among other subjects. He formerly served as a legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team in peace talks with Israel, participating in the summits at Camp David and Taba before joining the office of the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process. He's since consulted on a variety of legal infrastructure development and conflict resolution projects in the Middle East and elsewhere for institutions including the U.S. Department of State, the Norwegian Peacebuilding Resource Center, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and the European Council on Foreign Relations. His book, Federalism and Decentralization in the Contemporary Middle East and North Africa, co-edited with Asli Bali, was published by Cambridge University Press earlier this year.
We also have the privilege of hosting today Mira Sucharov. She's a professor of political science at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. She's the author or editor of 5 books, including most recently Borders and Belonging, a memoir in 2021, and Social Justice and Israel-Palestine, Foundational and Contemporary Debate. She has published over 35 scholarly articles and book chapters. She's a 9-time teaching award winning, including having received the top university teaching award in Ontario. Her many op-eds and articles have appeared in the Globe and Mail, Haaretz, The Forward, The Daily Beast, The Toronto Star, The Jerusalem Post, JTA, and Jewish Currents. She's currently working with Omar Dajani on a podcast about Palestinian and Jewish life in Haifa called The Vacant Lot. And also with Omar, a book under contract with Prometheus about equality and attachment in Palestine. It is our pleasure to have you both.
Okay, so I'll begin. I'm going to ask each of you to now introduce yourselves so that our community gets a sense of your relevant experience to our discussion tonight. Omar, if I could ask you to begin.
Thanks so much. Before we begin, I wanted to thank you for inviting us to be a part of this discussion. We really appreciate it. Rachel and Sheila and Adam. I know that this takes a lot of work and in a moment like this, also a lot of courage. So much gratitude to you. I wanted to note that I have been working on the issues that are going to be in play in our conversation today for decades. I started as a student activist back in the late 1980s, around the time that the first Palestinian Intifada erupted. In law school, when the Oslo peace process was just beginning, I did work pertaining to that as a law student, and then, as you mentioned, went on to participate more directly in the negotiations that were then unfolding as a legal advisor. And since that time, have worked in a range of different capacities, sometimes as an analyst, sometimes as an advocate, and sometimes from a distance as an academic. But I bring to this a perspective that is born from being the son of a Palestinian father and Syrian mother, of being someone who comes from a family that is both Muslim and Christian, someone who grew up in the United States, but has spent a lot of time over in the region. And finally, someone who has seen over the last 40 years, 53 years, if you count all of the years I've seen, tremendous transformations in the trajectory of the situation and conflict that we're about to describe today. And I think bearing in mind just how dramatically things can change is useful at a moment like this, for the worse, as we've seen, but also for the better. I look forward to the conversation. With that, I'll turn it over to Mira.
Thanks, Omar, and thanks to everyone, and also just particular gratitude for having the courage to do a webinar like this in Pittsburgh, which I know where you have a lot of collective trauma that we've all shared with you since 2018. Now, I'll sort of, the angle I'll take is that I want to talk about a t-shirt that I received when I was 6 years old, and it was brought home to me from Israel by my mom, who had gone on a trip there. And I think that my mom and my aunt had probably bought it together. My aunt and uncle had moved to Israel when I was a baby. And it was a t-shirt, it was polyester, and it was in the brown family. I remember that, the earth tones. And on it was the face of Yishar Cohen, who was a rock star, a pop folk star at the time in Israel, and he won Eurovision, and he won for a very famous song, a Bani Bi, which is sort of a Pig Latin version of Hebrew, and it means I love you. And I treasured this shirt. And then around the same time, I got a shirt from my Jewish school, and it was a shirt for planting a tree. Now you only get certificates, but back then the swag was even better. And it was a shirt from the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. It had a pocket, and it had really bright green and black paint, and I treasured that shirt. And years later, I started to study a bit more about what the JNF was all about, and my political overlay eclipsed the meaning, part of the meaning that shirt held for me.
I think I think we'll have to get back to Mira.
So,
Sorry.
why don't you? Okay,
you're back.
back. You're back.
Oh, I didn't know I was gone. What did you last hear me say? Sorry.
How the shirts overlaid.
Yes, so years later, thanks for listening. Thanks for paying attention. And years later, I had a new insight into what the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, meant. And so I think what I want to invite us all to do is to think about, for those of us who have direct emotional attachments to space and place, to honor those and to think in parallel about the kinds of questions that scholars like Omar and I and all my fellow scholars ask as to what is just, what is right, and what is ethical. And that'll, I think, will be our challenge today.
So I want to ask you, how then did that lead you to do the work that you're doing today? How did you guys meet, and how can you tell us a little bit about the work that you have been doing together, and how you develop trust and in one another, and all those things?
Sure, I can start. After many years of studying the region and publishing on it, I realized that it was time to reach out to a Palestinian co-author, and it was time to share my voice and share the space on the page that I take up with many, many op-eds and academic articles with someone who comes from a different perspective, and maybe doesn't come from a different political perspective, but comes from a different set of attachments. And it was in May 2021, which was the last time that we saw great intensity and great suffering in Israel-Palestine, although there's been suffering arguably every day since. But it was the last time it was really on the global stage. And Omar had written a very personal and informative and educational piece on social media about the context for the Gaza-Israel war, and specifically about the history of Gaza in light of his own family's history of being driven out of Jaffa in April of 1948. And I shared that post, and Omar thanked me. And from then, we started talking and thought about ways that we could collaborate. And I want to just flag this idea of what it means to bring in context. And I think we're going to circle back to that in the coming hour. And Omar, I think it was very useful to give context for who are these Gazans, the majority of whom are descendants of refugees from 1948 Palestine, which became the state of Israel. But I also want to note that in a moment of, and I think Omar and I both agree on this, that in a moment of intense suffering, so starting, for example, from the massacre by Hamas of Israelis on Saturday, October 7th. Context is always important, but not at the moment of trauma, because giving context at the moment of trauma intensifies the injury and intensifies the trauma. And I think that is what that's the dance we're really trying to do, as I think you called us humanists. That's high compliment, thank you, but an approach that takes humanity and compassion seriously, as well as academic exploration and a search for social justice. It's a dance of timing. And maybe I'll let Omar talk a bit more about our projects.
So I'll speak very briefly, because I also am keen for us to turn to the events of the last 10 days. But I think it matters a lot that Mira and I first connected, as she mentioned, in May of 2021, when for the first time in decades, Palestinians and Israelis inside Israel, inside what Palestinians call 48, were engaged in violence towards each other, in addition to the war that was unfolding across the border between Israel and the Gaza Strip. That we were able to respond humanly in that moment created an important foundation for the conversations that occurred subsequently. And I want to highlight that one of those conversations occurred over the course of writing a piece, which we would be happy to share with folks, in which we grappled with the origins of Zionism and our radically different feelings about Zionism and its implications. And we wrote things on the page and sent them to each other. Some of the things that we wrote were extremely tough to write and to read. We didn't spare each other with respect to laying out honestly what the narrative of our people and our respective selves in this context was. But we also, at every turn, undertook to approach each other with respect and by giving each other the benefit of the doubt. And I think that that has been crucial, especially as we have grappled for the last 2 years with a set of issues around the return of Palestinian refugees, around how you address the circumstances in which this conflict was born with respect and justice for all. And those issues have only gotten harder, of course, as the last 10 days have unfolded.
Thank you. Before we discuss the events of this week, we want to know if you have any thoughts about how we should or could go about talking about it. What kinds of distinctions may be useful as we begin this conversation? And Omar, I'll let you begin, and then we'll turn it over to Mira.
So I think that it's incredibly difficult to think about, as Mira pointed out, how to sequence conversations, how to acknowledge others' grief while at the same time offering necessary context. And one distinction actually that Mira flagged as she and I were processing last weekend, what was happening as it was happening, was a distinction that I think is really crucial for conversations about this, which is the distinction between justifying on the one hand and explaining on the other. That it is possible for us to offer a full explanation for the circumstances that cause people to take the actions that they do and the consequences of those actions without necessarily justifying the actions. And so to give an example from the last week, or two examples, for me as a Palestinian, I am profoundly aware of the circumstances in which Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have been living. But for me, it was not difficult to say unequivocally that I condemned and looked upon with revulsion the acts that Hamas militants engaged in, the attacks on and abduction of civilians in the towns and kibbutzim around the Gaza Strip. For me, expressing my revulsion at that was not in any way tantamount to offering justification for what Israel proceeded to do in the Gaza Strip in the coming days, nor was, in the same way, expressing my profound understanding for what Palestinians have experienced over these decades of occupation, tantamount to justifying these acts that were contrary, to my mind, to law and to morality that Hamas engaged in. We'll have lots more to say about both sets of things, but I think that distinction between explaining and justifying can help ease conversations about difficult things.
Is Mira?
Looks like she might have dropped off for a second.
Okay.
So while we have her back, we wanted to explore the events of the last 10 days. And we would like students and faculty to have an opportunity to get your input regarding this and explaining the broader context and the dangers ahead.
Sure. And so what I think makes sense in terms of a structure for this conversation following on the intervention I just made is I think that Mira and I will start by focusing in on what's happened over the last 10 days in chronological sequence. And then we will take a step back and look at the broader context. And so those impatient for context, please be patient with us. We will offer it, but we think it's crucial to lay out exactly what happened. And the most recent compounding tragedies that have been in the news started in the early morning hours in Israel, Palestine, as Hamas militants, through a variety of means, made their way across the different barriers that surround the Gaza Strip. Mira, I see that you're back. We
Back
have
at a better location. Hopefully it'll be okay this time. Thanks.
Okay, great. I was just starting to talk about what happened last Saturday morning. Would you like to take that one, and then I'll
Sure.
talk about the fallout this week? Okay,
Thank
great.
you. And also, I wanted to just push back, not really push back, but maybe add a clarification or correction when you said that we had radically different views on Zionism. And I think we don't. But I think what was very interesting is because we don't have radically different views on Zionism, the disparity between our views of how we should present it was very surprising to us. And that is where I think that's where friendship across political or ethnic lines can be very challenging, because differences can crop up when you don't expect them. And there was a sense of anxiety on my part, I can't speak for Omar, that how would we get through this? And we did, by figuring out a way to present it that seemed fair. And so I think that I just wanted to note that. Last Saturday, I tend to wake up in the middle of the night around 5 a.m. and I tend to check my phone, unfortunately. Thanks for that map, that'll help me. And I started checking my phone around 5 a.m. Eastern time. So it was well into the mid-morning in Israel. And I saw some news. I was scrolling through news and social media, and I saw yellow gates. And those yellow gates are gates that secure kibbutzim, agricultural villages, from outside intruders. And there was some sense that there had been an invasion into some kibbutzim, but I wasn't quite sure what. So I texted my kibbutz brother, sort of a very close family friend. I can explain what that means later. And I said, what the hell's going on over there? And he said, and I said, are your parents okay? And he said, yes, but they're traumatized. And I said, what? I mean, they're used to living under constant barrage of rocket fire. In fact, last summer, Omar and I were visiting them, and they had given very sort of graciously, they had offered Omar the bedroom that is the sealed room that is all Israelis, if they can afford it, have in their homes to protect from rocket fire. So Omar had the sealed room. I had the bedroom next door. This was last July. In the middle of the night, I awake to a huge crash. I stop myself from saying to Omar, are you okay? Are you okay? Because I try not to be that kind of friend that's sort of henpecky. And I think maybe his laptop fell off his bed if he was up late grading the law school papers that I knew he still had to grade. The next morning, this is last July, the next morning I get a text message from my kibbutz mom. Again, I can go into that, but a very close family friend. She's down the hall and she says, hi, Mira, good morning. This is all in Hebrew. She's texting me a couple of things. First, you have to reminder to hang yours and Omar's laundry outside so that there's time to dry. And second of all, did you hear the crash last night? That was a rocket, and it probably fell a couple of 100 meters away from the house, but the military never reveals the exact location. So Omar and I were sort of rattled, and we talked about it, and there was a little bit of well, this is just how it is here. So when my very close family friend Ofer said, my parents are traumatized last Saturday, I realized something was up. And he went on to relay to me that they had been hiding in their secure room, the one that Omar had slept in just a few months earlier, and had heard Hamas militants prowling outside the house. The military and the police, as many of you know from news reports, took hours to arrive. And so the volunteer civil defense group on the kibbutz had come to their rescue and had killed the two terrorists, essentially, or would-be terrorists. And Ofer had sent me a photo of them with body scratched out of respect for the dead. But I could see that was they were lying dead on the sidewalk at the very same spot that Omar and I had gotten out of our rental car, and Omar had presented Yonit, my family, very close family friend, with a gift of drinking glasses of Hebron glass just a few months earlier. And so that kibbutzim, I'm not going to necessarily say where it is out of just some sort of respect for some privacy, but it's one of the red dots on this map here. And I'll let, and then I went back to the news and I saw that Kibbutz Be'eri was under grave attack. So I messaged the friend that I have on that kibbutz, and Omar also is friendly with her. We went to visit her together, and this was last July, and she offered us tea and cake, and we interviewed her for our podcast, and we got to know her, and she wanted us to keep in touch, and I had been to visit her once before as well. And I texted her, "Are you all right?" And I didn't hear back. So I contacted cousins of mine on the West Coast. It was still early for them. "Can you please check on Vivian?" They are close friends with her. I hear that things are very bad on Be'eri. As the hours progressed, we realized that Vivian Silver, who is a fairly well-known peace activist, especially with regard to the Gaza and Israel envelope with the villages around the kibbutzim around the Gaza Strip. She's very active in reaching out to Gazans and trying to create a corridor of communication, and that's her on the right. She has been taken hostage and is sitting in captivity right now in Gaza. And here she was just sort of playfully showing us a bottle of wine that she had picked up from one of the very few Palestinian wineries called Taiba.
So I just wanted to add a little to what Mira has laid out. So over the course of the weekend, as I suspect most of you have seen on the news, Hamas's attack played out and resulted in the deaths of some 1,400 Israelis, and that, it's important to add, includes both Israeli Jews and Arabs, citizens of Israel, who were also caught in the indiscriminate character of the violence. And it was pretty immediate that we knew that in the wake of those attacks, many of which were conducted using absolutely horrible means, and I'm sure I don't need to recount them to an audience that's been watching the news over the last week. We knew that Israel's response to those attacks would be ferocious, and that the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, whom we knew, would be vulnerable. And I wanted to identify the other person in the picture that you see up on the screen, who is a woman named Sada, who is, along with her husband, on a recent trip that they took this last summer. Sarah lives in Gaza City. She's both mine and Mira's Arabic tutor, and has become a good friend in the time that she has been our teacher. And she and her family live in Gaza City, which, as we'll tell you more about, has recently been subjected to not only bombardment, but evacuation orders, which many in the northern Gaza Strip have begun to implement. But I wanted to point out that in the we'll have more to say about individual actions on each side, but as almost immediately after the events of last weekend, Israel began bombarding the Gaza Strip. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Gaza Strip and the circumstances in which it was born as a way of understanding the context. And so right at the outset, I'd like to be sure that all of you are familiar with the basic map of the space that we are talking about. You see up here on the screen a map of Israel and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The map on the right is, of course, focused on the West Bank. And you see here in red the Gaza Strip. And the Gaza Strip, as you have probably heard, has been under the administration of the Hamas movement since the year 2008, though Hamas has been involved in Palestinian government since 2 years earlier than that, since 2006. Now, I want. It's so difficult for me. I confess it. Even as I'm talking to you now, I find myself going back and forth in my mind between wanting to offer context and also wanting to convey, even before I do, what Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are experiencing at this moment. And so forgive me if I seem a little torn in that sense, but I'm going to try to give you just a little bit of context first. And so in order to give you a sense of just how close the quarters that we are talking about are, this is a picture of that Mira and I took in the kibbutz where, as she mentioned, we spent a few days this summer. And you can see in the distance the lights of Gaza City and in the background to give you a sense of just how close things are. And this map, which is maybe resonates more for folks in my corner of the country than over in Pittsburgh, will give you a bit of a sense of just how close the quarters are that we're talking about. If you look on the right side, you can see that the Gaza Strip is itself just about the size of a space extending from one side of San Francisco to the end of Berkeley, and that the entire area that we're talking about of Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip is roughly the size of the San Francisco Bay Area. And those close quarters affect how we Israelis and Palestinians live alongside each other, the challenges that this presents. Now, I want to point out that the Gaza Strip has not always been the Gaza Strip. That prior to 1948, what we know to be Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip comprised what was called the Mandate of Palestine, a space that was under British rule. And the mandate ended in 1948. And there's lots that we could tell you about the circumstances, but I want to tell you about one particular piece of this story, in part because it's a piece that my own family's history is implicated in. My family came from the city of Jaffa in Arabic, which you can see here on the screen right there. And in April of 1948, under bombardment by Jewish militias on each side of Jaffa, militias that would, within a month, form what became the Israeli army when Israel declared independence in that month. So under bombardment, thousands of Palestinians from Jaffa fled, fearing for their lives and looking for safety. Some of them, like my family, fled north toward Lebanon, but thousands fled south instead, towards Egypt. And many stopped in the city of Gaza. And the city of Gaza, by early May of 1948, already had taken in 10% of its population worth of refugees. But within a year and a half, that the Gaza area would absorb another 200,000 refugees, the number greatly eclipsing the number of Gazans who were there. When armistice lines were drawn in 1949 around what came to be known as the Gaza Strip, those 200,000 Palestinians, combined with those who had previously been living there, found themselves effectively trapped. Palestinians from, in particular, from the surrounding areas, the agricultural communities that surrounded Gaza, being thenceforth unable to return to their lands, to their homes, to their farms, in what became Israel. And so I mention this context because as we think about both what's just happened and as we think about what should happen in the future, it's important to bear in mind that for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, many of them see the territory inside Israel as home and have longed to return to that space. Now, I'll end, because I know we've got much more ground to cover, by noting that in the last week, the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have suffered a range of extraordinary challenges. They've been subjected to a brutal aerial bombardment, and tons and tons of bombs have been dropped on the Gaza Strip, an amount equivalent to the amount that the United States dropped on Afghanistan in the space of 1 year. In the small confines of the Gaza Strip, you can get a sense of the space. That has resulted in a large number of civilian deaths. As of today, some 2,800. And so the 1,400 Israeli deaths have been compounded by another almost 3,000 Palestinian deaths, making this the bloodiest conflict in a very long time in this space. And on top of that, Palestinians inside the Gaza Strip are struggling with a lack of electricity and lack of water as a result of Israel closing both off, and a lack of an idea of where to go next. So there's much more that both Mira and I could say about what's just happened, but let me turn it back to our moderators to guide us through a conversation about that and about how to go forward.
Thank you. Mira, if you could lead us in a conversation about what is Hamas and whether Hamas represents all Palestinians, what appears to have motivated Hamas attacks from the research and work that you have been doing, because I know there's a lot of conversation in the chat, in the Q&A regarding this. Could you share your thoughts with us?
Yes, thanks. And I'm also going to toggle back and forth between this, the more historical and political context, and some notes on the emotions that are circulating right now. So, and I'd actually like to do that with just I know we haven't formally gone to the Q&A, but I happened to spot one of the questions, and I think it's helpful at this point. And someone was asking how he can be in community with people in his campus or city who have praised the Saturday massacre by Hamas against Israelis. And I think this gets at another question about the framing, how we talk about these things. And one thing that I find, so we talked earlier about the difference between justification and explanation. And in a sense, Sheila, your question is a little bit about explaining, certainly not about justifying. I didn't interpret it that way, nor will I be justifying those heinous unjustifiable and unjustified attacks. But I think one thing that might help the questioner is, and it's not just advice for the questioner, it's also advice for the other people who may be watching this and may have praised those attacks. And I know there are many groups that I have followed whose mission I had normally supported and who praised those attacks, and I'm very disturbed as well. So what I think I would urge myself to do, and the questioner and people who I still want to be in community with, because we have to live together, is really to separate, understand, not only explaining from justifying, but I'll add another word that gets very tricky, very ordinary word, but it's a very dangerous word, understanding. And I think what I would do here is I would say, let's try to understand the emotions. Let's try to understand the rage of Palestinians who are kept in an open air prison, who are governed by Hamas, who they may or may not support, more on that in a minute, and whose external freedom of movement, airspace, sea space, along ground entry and exit, items, objects, things that can come in and out of the strip are controlled by Israel, with the exception of one of the two ground entries and exits being controlled by Egypt. So there is, not to mention, having been driven out from their homes in 1948, including many from Jaffa, as Omar said, where they fled out of fear as shelling occurred by pre-state Israeli forces into their neighborhoods before the Arab-Israeli war, before May of 1948. A lot of this happened in April. And so they want to either come home. Of course, they want to come home. They haven't even gotten compensation for their houses. They haven't even gotten any form of recognition for the properties that they left behind as they were fleeing for their lives. So we can understand rage. We can also understand the rage of Israelis right now who want revenge. I understand that. I think I would feel the same. But that's different than justifying collective punishment on Gazans. It's different than justifying cutting off food, fuel, and water. So we can understand the emotions, but it doesn't mean that we have to extend that understanding of emotional spaces to justifying particular types of actions. And I think that would be very helpful as your campus, and probably my own as well, engages in repairing relationships that are going on right now. In my case, it has to do with unions. In Canada, many unions have spoken out in ways that have really disturbed some folks. I don't know how, if your campus is unionized. I haven't checked on that. Hamas was actually helped along in its infancy in the late 80s by Israel. It emerged as an alternate, as a rival to the PLO. Israel wasn't too fond of the PLO in the 80s, as the first Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising, had taken Israel by surprise and was forcing it to face its decades-long occupation, at the time 20-year-long occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. And Hamas started as a movement, as many things do, and it gained a lot of domestic support, partly by supplying social services that its people weren't getting in other ways, as many religious-based organizations are able to do with networks of mosques and other social outlets of providing food and childcare and things like that. And then Omar has spoken about the PA, the Palestinian Authority, having a major break with Hamas after the Palestinian elections of 2006. Hamas ended up taking control over the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian Authority ended up taking control over the West Bank. But that control in both places is limited. It's limited by an overarching matrix of Israeli control. In the West Bank, it's more day-to-day. It's more freedom of movement within the West Bank for Palestinians. And night raids into homes. In the West Bank, as I said, it's more about air, sea, electricity grid, population registry. But I'll let Omar talk to us a little bit more about Hamas and what they might be wanting right now. Oh, I do have one more thing to say that's, I think, really key. The last poll that I've seen is from a couple of years ago, where in the Gaza Strip, I don't know if I want to say only. I'm just going to say it, 30%. Some people will say only. Some people will say that's too many. I'll just state it neutrally. 30%, 1 in 3 of Palestinians, according to polls from a couple of years ago, support Hamas. Again, they don't have much political alternative because there aren't very many other vibrant or real political options there.
Should I jump in?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so and apologies, there's a little bit of construction noise on this end, so apologies if you can hear it on yours. Yeah, I would just add two things to what Mira has laid out. The first is that maybe 3 things. Mira made a really important point about collective punishment. And to my mind, the prohibition of collective punishment, which is something that humanitarian law is very, very clear about, and that I think we can all agree on morally, that we shouldn't punish folks for things that they are not individually responsible for. I think that norm is crucial when we talk about both the problem with terrorist attacks and when we talk about the problem with an assault on a population like the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. So when you look at the polls that were just done in September of 2023 by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, what they indicate is that Hamas has the support of about 30% of Palestinians overall. And those numbers rise slightly within the Gaza Strip. What the poll suggests was that Hamas inside the Gaza Strip had about 38% in September of 2023. But the same polls also point out that about 59% of Palestinians in Gaza felt that it was not possible to criticize Hamas without fear. That is an important statistic because it helps to put into perspective the fact that the Palestinians who are suffering the brunt of what is occurring right now in the Gaza Strip are not responsible for what happened last weekend. Many of them are as horrified by those events as any of us here on the call are. And so when we think about the prosecution of this battle, what we've got to understand is that even if the press frames this as a war between Israel and Hamas, it is experienced as a war between Israel and the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, who are experiencing the deprivation that we've just been talking about. I also wanted to say one other thing about the broader context in which this has happened. And Mira has also touched on this. You've heard, I suspect, in the news that the Israeli government has called upon Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, particularly in the northern part of the Gaza Strip, to leave their homes and to flee toward the south in order to avoid the full thrust of the ground invasion that seems imminent there. And I wanted to stress how difficult it is for Palestinians to comply for two distinct reasons. One is, of course, that there's not much room in the Gaza Strip for people to go to, right? We've already talked about how small this space is, how limited the opportunities are to find shelter, how vulnerable people are in that tiny space, just the size of San Francisco and Berkeley, to remove themselves from the area of danger. But I also want you to bear in mind the broader context that I mentioned a little earlier on, that Palestinians a few generations ago received similar calls to leave their homes during wartime, and then subsequently were not permitted to return to their homes. And so when Palestinians hear a call like this to leave, what they hear is an echo of what we call the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948. And so it's not just that Hamas is urging some Palestinians to stay in their homes that is actually causing them to do so, and deepening the humanitarian catastrophe that we are facing in this moment.
Thank you both so much. I guess building on that, I wanted to ask, first of all, the next question that it's the next question that we had for you, and it's a question that just came up in the Q&A as well, which is that, you know, keeping all of this in mind, is a peaceful future possible, and what could that possibly look like?
I'm going to let Omar take that, but I just want to say one thing. I'm giving him the hard one. When Omar talked about the size of, not specifically the size of the Gaza Strip, but the size of the whole area, and compared it to geographic spaces that we're used to here, we often see maps of Israel transposed onto maybe Lake Michigan if you're American, maybe Lake Winnipeg if you're Canadian, and it's often used as a talking point, actually, by the Israeli public diplomacy. There used to be a campaign on Canadian campuses many years ago called "Size Doesn't Matter," pun intended, right, or innuendo intended. And I just want to stress that it's so easy to get caught up in talking points. And in that case, it was the idea Israel's so small, Jews only have one tiny country, Arabs should, that was the idea, Arabs should take care of their own, Palestinians have many countries, Arabs have many countries, Palestinians can go to other countries. But really, I think the approach that Omar and I are really trying to drive home is that individuals aren't, to an extent, they're part of groups such that Jews here are feeling very triggered. Jews here in North America are feeling very triggered and traumatized by what went on Saturday, October 7th. And I just want to note that there is Holocaust trauma being activated in ways I have never seen in my lifetime among my generation. So I'm just going to give you one example. So I'll come back to this example, but my broader point is that we exist both in relation to our communities, and we both have unique lives and unique houses. And just because Omar's family heritage is part Syrian and part Palestinian and part Christian and part Muslim and part French doesn't mean that he should just pick one of those countries and be fine with his family home having been appropriated by the state and not having had any right for his family to return or even get compensated. So we live both in the level of individual uniqueness and in the level of context and community. And I think those are both important modes, and they both need to be honored at any given time. So I just want to note one thing about the trauma that's being activated, which also connects to whether there's a peaceful future. I mean, I think there has to be a peaceful future. There's no other option. But this is why it's going to be so difficult. The trauma is intense. I'll just give you an example. I have a friend. We went to camp together back in the 80s. He's a professional in the arts industry. I've never seen him post anything about Israel. I've never seen him really post anything about Jewish matters, unlike a lot of my friends. And that's sort of our side gig, is posting all the time about the Jews. I've never seen him do that. Today, he posted a piece that he shared about being triggered by Nazi intergenerational memory of having Nazis come into your house to take you hostage or to kill you. This is what people are feeling right now. And I've been watching this region and living there and following it very closely for my whole childhood and adult life. And I've never seen this level of trauma by Jews outside of Israel. Turn it to Omar.
Thanks very much, Mira. I also want to second everything that you just said, and to note that we're talking about a country, a small country, haunted by traumas, and right now it is very much the case that both the Holocaust and the Nakba, the catastrophe that I spoke of earlier, are being invoked in the public domain, and people are re-experiencing aspects of those traumas, and those inform their fears, and they inform their perceptions of where threats emerge from, and they inform their reactions to things. And so as we are talking through this week, we've got to be really mindful of that broader context and what people are bringing to it. I also want to second the point that Mira made about not allowing us to think that the small size of the land that we're talking about means that there's not room for all of us who belong to it there. I'm going to share my screen again for just a second, because I'd like to tell you about what I think has been a source of hope for me over the last few years, but especially over the last 10 days, which is an emerging movement in Israel-Palestine, which is called A Land for All. And this is a movement that is comprised of and co-led by both Palestinians and Jewish Israelis. And all levels of it are comprised of folks from both communities, and this includes Palestinians in the West Bank, in supporters in the Gaza Strip and inside Israel, as well as Israeli Jews, not only from inside Israel, but also including Israeli settlers in the West Bank. It's a very broad-based movement that draws upon a range of folks who have historically been alienated from the peace process. The reason that it gives me hope is two things. Number one, it is a movement that is premised upon values and on the belief that if we commit to the values of equality on the one hand and mutual self-determination on the other hand, that it's possible for us, even in a relatively small space, to live together. Indeed, I think one of the things that is a crucial thing to bear in mind during these incredibly dark days is that neither Jews nor Palestinians inside Israel, Palestine, are going anywhere. Whatever ways we torture one another during these days will just make it harder for us to do the inevitable thing, which is to come back together and find a way of living together in peace, with respect for each other's histories, with respect for each other as individuals, and with respect for each other as communities that have an attachment to this place, have a sense of belonging in this place, and who will remain in this place. And so coming to terms with that now feels to me like a good way of thinking about how to behave during these times, recognizing that the people whom we're talking to are going to be our neighbors forever. And what A Land for All stands for, very practically speaking, is the idea that you can have two states with premised upon the idea of equal rights individually and collectively, and premised upon the idea that we should move gradually toward freedom of movement and residence, with, of course, adequate security guarantees to ensure that that's done in a way that protects people from both communities. I've got lots more that I could tell you about it, but I just want to say a very last thing, which is that the board of A Land for All, which is, as I mentioned, comprised of both Palestinians and Jews, was just comprised about 6 weeks ago and met for the first time this last week, during what is perhaps the worst week that you can imagine. And what moved me is that even during these incredibly dark times, that it was possible for Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs, to come together in solidarity and to find ways of communicating about their grief, and looking toward the future despite what we're seeing around us. I'll stop there.
So, Mira, I want to stay in hope. And so it is a heavy moment, but we have reached a point in the conversation that seems to be telling us that there are challenges and opportunities ahead with dialogue, but that there's also hope. So could you talk to us about this?
I think the hope is in thinking about what we do have control over here in North America. And I think what we do have control over is how we communicate. And we often communicate very badly, but one way we can improve our communication across communities and even within communities, I mean, I'm a Jew, we fight a lot with each other within the Jewish community, never mind across the Jewish-Palestinian divide, is thinking about values. And Omar's talked about values, and I'm talking about values, and that is, what do you stand for? And when you articulate your values, you then open up space for others to join you. And so then it doesn't always matter what kind of political solution you're proposing, as long as you can find some shared ground. And I think the first way to do that is, what do you stand for and what do you care about? And values are ways of separating the ideas from the specifics for the moment, and then you can move forward together. And so I know what values guide me is humanity, safety, and I've stopped using the word security unless absolutely necessary. I now use the word safety. And so also noticing which words have become very loaded. So for example, security is often a very loaded word to Palestinians because their rights have been denied on a daily basis in the name of security. More security than is necessary. And I think if we talk about safety, then we say, well, I want my Jewish brothers and sisters in Israel to be safe? What is required for them to be safe? So it's a subtle difference, and it can start to roll back some of the anxieties in talking across communities. Similarly, the word Zionism, which even Omar and I earlier on in this conversation, we were sort of dancing around, what does that mean? We've talked through this a lot, but we haven't talked through it a lot with all of you. I have an article about it where I surveyed Jewish Americans a couple of years ago, and they had wildly different understandings of what Zionism even meant. And so what do you mean when you use these terms? So really defining your terms and then taking them back into the values of safety, dignity, freedom. And for me, it's not just an individual's right to be safe and free. I also want collective Jewish identity. I want the furtherance of Hebrew. I want the furtherance of Israeli culture. I want to be able to wear that t-shirt, or the t-shirt no longer fits me, but I want to be able to listen to that Israeli rock star, the winner of the 1978 Eurovision, Abani B by Yishar Cohen, and not be mocked on Facebook for being a baby killer if I listen to that music, because I want my culture to be honored, but I also want everybody, Palestinians and Jews, to be able to live safely and in dignity. And I hope my Arabic gets better too. That's a long road.
Omar, talk to us about hope and challenges and opportunities.
I'm sorry, Sheila, could you repeat the question?
Could you talk to us about hope and challenges and opportunities?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, so as I was mentioning earlier, for me, my hopefulness is wrapped up in action, in getting behind a set of ideas and trying to find ways of bringing them into effect. And I feel able to pursue that both as an academic, working through a project with a partner over at University College London, in which we are trying to put meat on the bones of the vision that I articulated earlier, and to think very carefully through how you implement what may seem to sound like idealistic ideas in a manner that ensures the safety and security of everyone in that space, per Mira's earlier intervention. So I think that that's part of it. I think a second part is, and this is really echoing Mira's point, being clear about values. And for me, that's been helpful this week, to be honest. I am, as I mentioned at the outset, had no difficulty whatsoever condemning what Hamas did, just as I have no difficulty condemning what Israel is undertaking to do right now, and trying to bring to the attention of folks across this country the dangers present for Palestinians in the Gaza Strip most immediately, but also more broadly for Palestinians and Israelis and people across the Middle East, of allowing this to continue to escalate. We are in a incredibly explosive, a moment with incredibly explosive potential, and recognizing that, and ringing the bell as loudly as possible also feels not only important, but as a way of kind of getting some of the tension that I feel in my heart out. So a combination of being forward-looking and hopeful based on values and relationships, and sounding alarms about the situation that we see here in the moment. And the very last thing I'll say, and I have to really emphasize this, is that it's been incredibly valuable for me over these 10 days to be able to process things with Mira, to have a professional partner who is also a dear friend to talk through things with, across these communal lines, which feel very significant in some moments and feel artificial at others. Being able to process these things together is not impossible. It's actually incredibly valuable, and I'm grateful for that too.
Thank you both so much, and for leaving us with this message of starting conversations by leading with our values. I think that's incredibly valuable, especially right now. We are going to move now to Q&A. I had a whole kind of speech planned about how we aren't going to air any questions that in any way dehumanize Muslims, Jews, Palestinians, or Israelis. But I'm really happy to say I've been looking through the Q&A, and the questions are all really just respectful and exactly in the spirit in which we began this conversation. So I feel like I don't need to do that, and we can just start addressing some of these questions. And I apologize right off the bat that we are not going to have a chance to address everything. But Sheila and I will do our best to go through as many as possible, and I know Mira and Omar will do their best to answer as many as possible. So the first question I'm going to ask is someone who's saying, she would love some advice on how to speak with young Middle Eastern students who emphatically reject hate and violence and terrorism, but don't want to have to continue justifying or defending themselves that they're not pro-Hamas or they're not anti-Semitic. And how should she guide them in their public written expression?
So these are, when you say Middle Eastern, you don't mean, probably doesn't mean Israeli in this case. Was that the idea? Or
I assume so.
Maybe. Omar? Because Omar, you've been one of those young students, but though American, and you've had to navigate those spaces on campus when you were a young campus activist as well.
I do think it's a hard question. I think that I'll start by saying that it is deeply unfair that so many assumptions get made about people depending upon what they're wearing on their heads or what their last names are. And so I feel for the students of the person who asked the question. And so I wish that one didn't have to sort of reassure. I think that this is a moment for reassuring one another. I think this is a moment for reaching out and sometimes gratuitously saying things that we know others need to hear. And sometimes that can take the form of saying, hey, I as a Palestinian want to be very clear about what I stand for and what I don't stand for. Or I, as a Jew, would like to do that. And I realize that demanding that of people is unfair, but I think doing it proactively can be valuable. And trying to do these things with and statements. I am a Palestinian who believes that Israeli civilians have a right to be free from violence, and who believes that Palestinian civilians have the same right and have a right to equality and an end to occupation. I think that laying out these things in this moment is valuable, even if it's frustrating to be judged for not laying out a litany of declarations right at the outset. Sorry if that's not a satisfying answer.
I want to add something, a personal anecdote. As the news was unfolding, I was letting Omar know that Saturday morning what was happening with my family friends. And Omar said, should I text them and see if they're okay? I don't know if they want to hear from me. I said, of course, if you want to, you absolutely should. And so Omar did. He wrote a lovely note, hoping you're okay, wishing worrying about your safety, thinking about you. And they responded right away. And then several hours later, when I finally got a chance to speak to them by voice, I was talking to Yonit, my close family friend, and her husband, Ellie, my also very close friend, was chiming in from the background. Can you please tell Omar I'm sorry that my response to him, which was like 2 lovely sentences, I'd seen it because I was copied on it, was brief. Now, Ellie at that point had a bullet in his hand, which he will never be able to remove. The bullet is actually from the IDF because the IDF confused them with Hamas terrorists as they were leaving their kibbutz to safety in the north, towards the north, driving a car that had no windshield because Hamas militants had shot out the windshield several hours earlier. So they were wounded essentially by their own military. And he so much wanted Omar to know that he was sorry that he didn't write 6 sentences in response. People are starved for connection and people are starved for reassurance. That said, and I think Omar was sort of hinting at this, we don't want to make sure that we have to say, I'm a good Jew, I'm a good Arab, I'm not like the others. We don't want to have to imply that being Jewish is somehow bad, but I'm one of the good ones. That's internalized anti-Semitism, or being Palestinian is bad, but I'm one of the good ones. So we really don't want to pressure anyone into that kind of defensive move either, because that's Islamophobic or anti-Semitic or anti-Palestinian.
There's a question that I think it's also very important, because I think we all have been thinking about this, that there's a lot of misinformation, and how do people sift through all the barrage of information and made up information? What are your recommendations of how people, learn better about what's going on and sift through the misinformation?
I mean, I still believe in the media. I still believe in news, especially legacy news media. So I read widely news sites that are that I think uphold standards, and I just continue to read those news sites. So I always hear this whole thing about misinformation, but aren't people reading the news? I mean, I've just had a very large, very significant fight with someone who is denying the numbers. I mean, these are reported widely in the news. I don't understand what the doubt is.
So I think that a lot of people get their news through social media, right? And I think that is part of the problem and part of the issue. And I have an 18-year-old that gets most of his information and news through social media platforms. And that, I guess, it's what the question is coming from, this constant misinformation and posting.
No, you have to check. If you're going to share a post, you have to check it against mainstream news media. It won't take long, but check it before you forward it. I mean, that's what I told my students this morning as well, in class.
I think that social media can be an incredibly valuable source of stories, a way of connecting with individual people's experiences. And so I think that it serves a crucial service. And I think I understand why people look at it, but I really agree with Mira that folks need to turn for context, and context is so important to publications that are trustworthy. And to me, I'll mention that in addition to the New York Times, which I will say has done a really good job reporting and as a Palestinian who for years has been super frustrated by the New York Times reporting with respect to Israel-Palestine, I have been impressed with what it has been doing over the last few years, but particularly this week, and in contrast to the television news, which has been, from my perspective, awful, has been impoverished with respect to Palestinian perspectives, and beyond perspectives, simply with respect to showcasing what Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have been experiencing. Other sources that I think are really valuable include the New York Review of Books, which is for folks who just want to have a longer form understanding of what's going on. It's a really great source. And for anyone who is just beginning to become familiar with the history of this conflict, I recommend an article that was first published in the New York Review and that just came out as a book which I have recommended before, A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, which you can find on the New York Review website, and which I think really does a great job of striking a balance between the personal story and the broader historical context. 972, the website, is also a really wonderful source of excellent journalism about what's happening in Israel-Palestine, that's not as mainstream in its orientation as some of the other sources that we've described.
To that, I would add Haaretz and Times of Israel, but Times of Israel, I would say the reporting is solid, but I don't vouch for the blogs because they used to, I don't know if they still do, but for many years they had a disclaimer that they didn't stand by the facts of the blogs. So I would stick to the reporting in that publication per se. I was, for very many years, I was a blogger at Time and columnist at Haaretz, so those I stick by.
Thank you. This is also helpful, I think, for many of us. I want to ask another question that we got, I think responding to how you were both talking about the importance of acknowledging the trauma of everyone in the region. She was wondering if you might be able to highlight the specific experiences of trauma that Mizrahi Jews are also carrying with them, and how that might play out in terms of communicating and what's going on in the region. Because I mean, there's the Holocaust, but that's not the only. I guess that's one of, I think, many traumas that Jews of different backgrounds, they might be referencing something else.
That's a very great point, because of course not all Jews are Ashkenazi. I've grown up in cities that are in Canada that are heavily Ashkenazi, and it's very important to realize that not all Jews are. I don't quite have the total breakdown right now of the numbers, but certainly many Jews in Israel are not Ashkenazi. They come from Arab countries or North Africa and Middle East, elsewhere in the Middle East. And their trauma, maybe their founding trauma vis-a-vis anti-Semitism is certainly not the Holocaust. It would be the expulsion from the Arab countries that their parents or grandparents came from right in the aftermath of Israel's founding. So in 51, when most of them immigrated to Israel or elsewhere. And then compounding that, there was the trauma of being prejudiced, facing prejudice within Israel by the Ashkenazi elite. Now, you'll hear different versions. I mean, some Mizrahim don't want to even particularly identify as Mizrahim. They just want to say they're Jewish. They just want to say they're Israeli. So different Mizrahim have different, I think, salience of identity as to how salient, how relevant that part of their Jewish identity is versus simply being Jewish in the Israeli context, at least. And again, I'm not Mizrahi, so I can't speak personally to that experience. But I think that question is really important to remember, that the Holocaust does not directly touch every Jewish family, nor does it touch directly Jews by choice.
Thank you. There's also several questions regarding how to better engage the American Jewish community in this conversation. If you guys have recommendations on how to bridge that and bring them to the conversation.
So I have sort of been through the ringer with the Jewish community. I mean, if you think the Palestinian on this panel has been through the ringer with the Jewish community, I really think I'm the one who really has the war wounds on that, the discursive war wounds, not to make light of actual war, physical war going on right now. So I've been completely cut off by my aunt and uncle who live in Israel, who I was very close to all the years, and they were a part of the anchoring of my Israel attachment from a very young age, and are part of the reason why I still am so attached. So that's one thing. I don't have a success story, unfortunately, but I do have a success story, I think, in the last 10 days. I've gotten very few angry notes on my wall, and I'm used to getting a lot of angry notes. And that's because in the last 10 days, I think I've managed to when I post, not every post is trying to do all things all at once. And so then people don't accuse me of both sidesism, which of course was a very common accusation of Trump's discourse in the aftermath of 2017 in Charlottesville, where he made that terrible statement of good people on both sides. Instead, what I do is I kind of enter the suffering and concern for a single person, perhaps, or a single group. So sometimes my post is only about the kibbutzim, the agricultural villages that were under attack. Sometimes it's about my own personal history with those kibbutzim. Other times it's about Sarah, we talked about, our Arabic teacher who's pregnant right now, and I'm thinking back to the wonderful medical care that I received in Canada while I was pregnant, not living in a war zone, and asking the world or the powers that be, hoping that her care, that she is okay. And so people, when you enter, and I think Omar talked about this, the importance of storytelling, the importance, and I think Nathan Thrall's book that Omar mentioned, Day in the Life, is going to be very good at that. I haven't read the book version. It's coming soon. It's brand new. And so that way, you start to gain people's trust that you are there for their suffering and for their basic needs. What are their needs and what are their fears? And mocking the fears does not work. And there was such a tendency in the last many years to mock the fears of one side or another in some way. No mocking, no snark. And I also want to say one thing about, Omar mentioned the Land for All, the Confederation type solutions he's backing. When we first met, I mocked him a little bit on that first Zoom meeting. Do you remember, Omar? I hope it hasn't traumatized you. He said, well, I'm kind of into an adapted form of a two-state solution these days. And for my part, I had been an ardent two-stater, and I had fought in the blogosphere with those to my left and those to my right. Then I'd moved for a couple of years to a one-state solution. And at that point, when Omar said, I'm a bit of a modified two-stater, I think I basically said, what kind of Palestinian are you? And, we were sort of joking, but there was this idea that we all had to position ourselves with the right answer, with the most virtuous, the hippest proposal. And then later on, over the next year, I started just listening, and I actually looked at Omar's YouTube oeuvre, and I actually watched at length where he talked about a confederal solution. I just listened. And I sort of started absorbing what the value proposition was here. And then I ended up being drawn to that proposal after having moved from 2 to 1 and now to Confederation. Now, it doesn't mean that the answer, the happy ending, had to have been that I adopted Confederation, but the happy ending is to really listen to what is motivating the values. And then you can start to discuss, and then you can start to talk. And I think that's what we really need to do within the Jewish community that we haven't done enough of. And I'm a bit to blame too. I have all too often been snarky and dismissive of people who I feel don't get it. And I'm just trying to slow down right now.
Thank you so much for that. I know we have almost no time left, and we want to give everybody a very needed break for everything you've given us tonight. But I was wondering, first of all, if you might be able to share some resources that we can offer people who might not understand the differences between what a two-state solution is, what a confederate, what a modified confederation might look like. These are all, I know people who are in the peace space think about these distinctions all the time. But again, I think this understanding might be really helpful for people on the call who really want to understand, okay, what is the difference? Why hasn't a two-state solution gone anywhere? What were the issues with it? And why are we looking for alternative solutions? So any resources you could share there, I think would be really, really helpful. I'm going to just ask one last question, and this will be, and then we will say goodbye. But there's someone who just asked, for somebody who is not Israeli, Palestinian, Jewish, they want to know, from their background, what can they take to support both Israeli and Palestinian civilians?
So may I start on that front? So to my mind, there are three immediate things that we can all think about. And this is also a partial response to some of the questions that have been raised about what Israel should be doing in relation to Hamas and the Gaza Strip. So the first thing, I know I'm proud to have another law professor on the panel today, in Sheila. And I know that I suspect that there are some law students out in this group. But as a lawyer, I do want to stress, first of all, that international law can and should have a place in international affairs, particularly in moments like this. And international law is really clear about the importance of distinguishing between civilians and military objectives, and about taking an array of precautions to ensure that civilians are not caught in violence, whether it's because of the types of weapons that are used or the kinds of space in which they are used. And so I think the first thing that folks should do is to call your representatives and urge them to ask the United States to demand that Israel comply with what international humanitarian law requires of it with regard to its actions in the Gaza Strip and elsewhere. I didn't mention earlier that some 60 Palestinians have already been killed by Israeli forces and or settlers over the last week in the West Bank. And so this is really important. And of course, as I said earlier, actions targeting civilians are completely unlawful of the kind, and that's the category in which Hamas's actions fall in. But demanding compliance with IHL is really important. Secondly, there's so much giving that we can do. And so I'll mention a couple of organizations that are doing great work in the Gaza Strip, and I'm not sure if Mira would like to follow with some suggestions vis-a-vis Israel. But to my mind, American Near East Refugee Aid, ANERA, is a really fantastic organization, as is Palestine Children's Relief Fund, PCRF, and MAP out of the UK, MAP, also does really wonderful work. And so I think providing assistance in these moments, it's going to be more and more needed in the Gaza Strip, and I think will be valuable. But the very last thing I'll say is that we shouldn't imagine that Israel can succeed in vanquishing Hamas, in vanquishing and destroying the Palestinian national movement, even if one wanted it to succeed in those senses. What needs to happen if we are serious about moving to a different place is that the rights of Palestinians to freedom and equality need to be secured. People who lack both of those things, no matter how much force is thrown at them, will come back fighting. And at the end of the day, we need to address those long-standing deprivations if we're going to see a different kind of future for Israelis and Palestinians.
The only organizations I'd add to Omar's list are New Israel Fund, which itself funds many NGOs, non-governmental organizations, many organizations within Israel itself. And those organizations are for civil society and justice and equality for all citizens of Israel. And they also focus on anti-occupation organizations that are Israeli, that are working in the West Bank as well.
Well, we are out of time, and we want to thank you for sharing and holding space and for your wisdom for our PIT community today. I urge both of you to take good care of yourself. These are heavy times, but we appreciate you, and we are extremely grateful for you for being with us today. We also want to thank the Office of the Chancellor, the University Center for International Studies, the Jewish Studies Program, and the Center for Civil Rights and Racial Justice.
Yes, thank you so much to you both, to everyone who made this crucial conversation possible. And we join you in hopes for a better world and a better future for Israelis, for Palestinians, for everybody who lives in the region.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming tonight.